It was a long haul from Dallas to Albuquerque, and I had just crossed the Texas border into New Mexico. The highway stretched out before me like a black ribbon, disappearing into the horizon. The radio crackled with static, and I turned it off, preferring the silence. It was just me, the hum of the engine, and the open road. I first noticed him a few miles past the state line, a figure standing by the side of the road holding a scythe. I blinked, thinking my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but he was still there. Just a shadow in the periphery, a flicker of movement as I sped by. Must be some farmer, I muttered to myself, or a Halloween prank. But as the miles ticked by, the unease settled deeper into my bones. Every few miles, I'd see him again, always a little closer. The figure wasn't just a fleeting shadow anymore. He was becoming more distinct. Tall, gaunt, with a hood that obscured his face, and that damn scythe gleaming in the moonlight. I pressed harder on the gas pedal, trying to put more distance between us, but it didn't seem to matter. He was always there, lurking at the edge of the road, watching me with an intensity that I could feel even through the cab's metal and glass. I reached for my thermos, my hand trembling slightly. The coffee was cold and bitter, but I gulped it down, hoping the caffeine would chase away the creeping dread. The night was getting colder, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. I cranked up the heater, but it did little to dispel the icy fear creeping up my spine. The figure appeared again, this time almost close enough to touch. I could see the frayed edges of his cloak, the glint of metal in his hand. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat a thunderous echo in the stillness of the night. "What do you want?" I shouted into the darkness, my voice cracking. "Leave me alone." The figure didn't answer, just stood there, silent and menacing. I gripped the wheel tighter, my knuckles white. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination brought on by exhaustion and too many hours on the road. I needed to find a place to stop, to rest, to shake off this creeping sense of doom. I checked the GPS. There was a rest stop a few miles ahead. I just had to make it there, take a break, and everything would be fine. But as I approached the rest stop, I saw him again, standing at the entrance, blocking the way. I swerved, my tires screeching on the asphalt, and sped past. The rest stop disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the night. I couldn't stop. Not now. Not with him so close. I had to keep moving, had to outrun whatever nightmare was stalking me. The highway stretched on, endless and empty. My eyes were heavy, my vision blurring. I slapped myself hard, trying to stay awake. The figure appeared again, now in the middle of the road, forcing me to swerve once more. "God damn it!" I yelled, my voice hoarse. "What do you want from me?" No answer. Just the silent, relentless pursuit. The road began to twist and turn, winding through the desolate landscape. The figure was always there, around every bend, closer and closer. I could feel his presence, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me, stealing my breath. I had to end this. I couldn't keep running. I had to confront him, face whatever terror was haunting me. With a surge of determination, I slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt. The figure was there, just ahead, standing in the middle of the road, waiting. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, the night air biting into my skin. The highway was eerily silent, the only sound the crunch of gravel under my boots. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak. I took a step closer, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the tattered cloak, the rusted scythe. "Answer me!" I shouted, my voice echoing off the surrounding hills. The figure slowly raised its head, and I saw its face for the first time. Or rather, the lack of a face. Beneath the hood was nothing but darkness, an abyss that seemed to swallow the light. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This was no hallucination. This was real, and it was coming for me. I turned and ran, sprinting back to the truck, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I jumped into the cab and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I floored the gas pedal, the truck lurching forward. The figure stood in the road, watching as I sped away, its empty gaze boring into me. I drove for miles, not daring to look back, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. The highway stretched on, endless and empty, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Eventually, the adrenaline wore off, and exhaustion took over. My eyes grew heavy, my head nodding. I had to stop. I couldn't go on like this. I pulled into a truck stop, the neon lights flickering overhead. The parking lot was empty, the silence oppressive. I parked the truck and turned off the engine, the sudden quiet almost deafening. I climbed into the sleeper cab, my body aching with fatigue. I closed my eyes, hoping for a few hours of rest, but sleep was elusive. Every time I drifted off, I saw him, standing in the darkness, waiting. When I finally did fall asleep, my dreams were filled with nightmares. I was back on the highway, the figure always just behind me, no matter how fast I drove. The road twisted and turned, leading me deeper into the darkness, away from any hope of escape. I woke with a start, my heart pounding. The truck stop was silent, the only sound the distant hum of the highway. I checked the clock. It was just past dawn. The sun was rising, casting a pale light over the desolate landscape. I climbed out of the cab and stretched, my muscles stiff and sore. I needed to get back on the road, to put as much distance as possible between me and whatever horror was stalking me. As I started the engine, I noticed something on the ground, just outside the truck. I got out and walked over, my heart sinking as I saw what it was. A scythe. Rusted and old, the handle worn smooth from use. I looked around, but there was no sign of the figure. Just the empty highway stretching out before me. I picked up the scythe, my hands trembling. There was something carved into the handle, letters worn and faded. I held it up to the light, squinting to make out the words. Death follows. I dropped the scythe and stumbled back, my mind racing. This wasn't over. It would never be over. I climbed back into the truck and drove away, the scythe lying in the dust behind me. The highway stretched out before me, endless and empty, the sun rising on a new day. But I knew, deep down, that the highway reaper was still out there, waiting, watching. And one day he would come for me. The rain was relentless, hammering against the ancient stones of Dunbray Castle with a fury that seemed to seep through the very walls. It was a stormy afternoon in the Scottish Highlands, and our tour group had taken refuge in one of the castle's dimly lit chambers. As the tour guide droned on about the castle's history, my attention wandered to the far corner of the room, where an old wooden chest caught my eye. "Hey, look at this," I whispered to Emma, my girlfriend, nudging her elbow. She glanced over, curious. "What do you think is in there?" We exchanged a conspiratorial glance and made our way over, ignoring the guide's increasingly tedious lecture. The chest was covered in a thick layer of dust, and its iron hinges creaked ominously as we pried it open. Inside, nestled among moth-eaten velvet, lay an object that immediately captivated us. A large, archaic camera with a dark, polished wooden body and brass fittings. "It's beautiful," Emma breathed, reaching out to touch it. "Careful," I cautioned, though I couldn't resist the urge to hold it myself. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and as I lifted it, I noticed a name engraved on the side. Camera Obscura. Before we could examine it further, the tour guide called out to us, Please do not tamper with the artifacts. They are part of the castle's heritage." We nodded sheepishly and returned the camera to its resting place, though my curiosity was far from satisfied. As the tour concluded, I couldn't shake the feeling that the camera obscura held secrets waiting to be uncovered. That night, as the storm raged on, Emma and I found ourselves unable to sleep. The castle's guest quarters were drafty, and every creak and groan of the old building set my nerves on edge. Eventually, we decided to explore the castle on our own, armed with nothing but a flashlight and a sense of adventure. We navigated the labyrinthine hallways, our footsteps echoing through the silence. It wasn't long before we found ourselves back in the chamber, where we had discovered the camera obscura. This time, there was no one to stop us from indulging our curiosity. "Let's take a photo," Emma suggested, her eyes sparkling with mischief. I hesitated, but her excitement was contagious. We set the camera up, positioning it to capture the room. There was no film, of course, but we were more interested in the experience itself. Emma fiddled with the dials, and after a few moments, she stepped back. "Ready?" she asked. I nodded, and she pressed the shutter. There was a brief blinding flash of light and then darkness. The room seemed to shiver, the shadows deepening in the corners. "That was strange," I murmured, rubbing my eyes. "Yeah," Emma agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. We decided to return to our room, but as we turned to leave, the camera emitted a soft click, and a photograph slid out from a hidden compartment at its base. "How is that possible?" Emma gasped, picking up the photograph. It was a black and white image of the chamber, but there was something horribly wrong. In the photograph, the room was filled with people, gaunt, spectral figures with hollow eyes and expressions of sheer terror. They were all staring directly at the camera, directly at us. A chill ran down my spine. "Let's get out of here," I said, my voice shaking. We hurried back to our room, slamming the door shut behind us. As we huddled together, the photograph clenched tightly in Emma's hand. We tried to make sense of what we had seen. "Do you think it was a trick? Some kind of elaborate hoax?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I replied, but deep down, I knew there was no rational explanation. The next morning, we decided to confront the tour guide. We found him in the castle's main hall, preparing for another group of visitors. "We need to talk to you about the camera obscura," I said, thrusting the photograph into his hands. His face paled as he looked at the image. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "We took it last night," Emma explained. "The camera, it took this picture." The guide's hands shook as he handed the photograph back to us. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low and urgent. "The camera obscura is cursed. It doesn't capture the present. It captures the final moments of those who died within these walls." I felt a wave of nausea. "What do you mean?" "The castle has a dark history," he continued. "Many people met violent ends here. The camera shows their last moments, the terror they felt before they died. By taking that photo, you've invited their spirits into your lives." Emma's grip on my arm tightened. "What can we do?" The guide shook his head. "I don't know. No one has ever survived long enough to find out." Panic set in as we realized the gravity of our situation. We decided to leave the castle immediately, hoping that distance would somehow break the camera's hold on us. As we drove away, the storm finally began to subside. We didn't speak much, both of us lost in our thoughts. I kept glancing at the photograph, unable to shake the feeling that the figures in the image were watching us, waiting. That night, we checked into a small inn miles away from the castle. Exhausted, we fell into a fitful sleep, but our dreams were plagued by the haunted faces from the photograph. I woke in the early hours of the morning to find Emma standing by the window, staring out into the darkness. "Emma?" I called softly, She turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "They're here," she whispered. Before I could respond, a sudden icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles. The shadows in the corners seemed to come alive, coalescing into twisted, ghostly figures. The specters from the photograph surrounded us, their hollow eyes filled with a sorrow that chilled me to the bone. They reached out with skeletal hands, and I felt an overwhelming sense of despair. "We're sorry," I cried out, hoping to appease them. "We didn't mean to disturb you." Their voices filled the room, a cacophony of whispers and wails. "You have seen our pain," they intoned. "Now you must share it." The room began to spin, and a blinding light enveloped us. I felt as if I was being torn apart, my soul pulled in 100 different directions. Then, just as suddenly, it was over. I found myself back in the chamber of Dunbray Castle, the camera obscura in my hands. Emma was beside me, her face pale and drawn. The room was empty, but the sense of dread remained. "We have to destroy it," Emma said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I nodded, and together we carried the camera to the castle's courtyard. Using a heavy stone, we smashed it to pieces, watching as the wooden body splintered and the brass fittings bent and twisted. As the last remnants of the camera were reduced to rubble, I felt a strange sense of relief. The spirits were gone, their hold on us broken. We left Dunbray Castle that day, vowing never to return. The photograph, now just a memory, haunted us for years to come, a reminder of the darkness we had unwittingly unleashed. But we had survived, and that was more than could be said for those whose final moments had been captured by the camera obscura. I've been a night shift cab driver for over a decade now, and I've seen my share of the city's oddities. The neon lights, the bustling crowds, the silent streets of the early hours. I've seen it all. Or so I thought. Nothing could have prepared me for that one night, the night that changed everything. It was a typical Tuesday, and the rain had just begun to pour, turning the city streets into a slick maze of reflections and shadows. Business was slow, and I was contemplating calling it a night when my radio crackled to life. "Pick up at 5th and Elm," the dispatcher said. "Heading to the outskirts." I sighed, turning the wheel in the direction of 5th and Elm. The outskirts meant a long drive, but it also meant a good fare. As I approached the corner, I saw him standing there, a tall man in a dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He looked like something out of an old film noir, standing there under the dim streetlight. He slid into the back seat without a word. His presence filled the cab with an eerie silence. I glanced at him through the rearview mirror, but his face was still hidden in shadows. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Old Mill Road," he replied, his voice low and gravelly. "Near the cemetery." I nodded and started the meter. The rain was coming down harder now, the rhythmic patter against the windshield the only sound breaking the silence. We drove through the city, leaving the bright lights behind and heading into the dark, deserted outskirts. The roads were empty, the buildings growing sparser. "Ever heard of the ghost of Old Mill Road?" the passenger suddenly asked, breaking the silence. I shook my head. "Can't say I have. I'm not much for ghost stories." He chuckled, a dry, mirthless sound. "This one's different. They say there's a spirit haunting these parts, a vengeful spirit. A woman who was wronged in life and now seeks revenge on anyone who crosses her path." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to play it cool. "Sounds like a lot of superstition to me." "Maybe," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "but there's truth in every legend." The rain continued to pour as he began to tell the story. According to him, many years ago, a young woman named Emily lived in the area. She was beautiful and kind, but she fell in love with the wrong man, a man who promised her the world but left her with nothing but heartbreak and despair. Unable to cope, Emily took her own life, cursing the man who wronged her. Since then, her spirit has roamed Old Mill Road, seeking revenge on any who remind her of her lost love. I glanced at him through the mirror again, but he was still shrouded in darkness. "That's quite a story," I said, my voice betraying my unease. "It's more than a story," he replied. "It's a warning." We drove in silence for a while longer, the only sound the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. The road grew narrower, the trees denser. I had a growing sense of unease, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. Finally, we reached Old Mill Road. The cemetery loomed ahead, its iron gates twisted and rusty. "This is the place," the passenger said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "You can drop me here." I pulled over, my headlights casting an eerie glow on the tombstones. He handed me the fare, his gloved hand cold against mine. I glanced at the money, then back at him, but he was already stepping out into the rain. "Thanks for the ride," he said, tipping his hat. I watched as he walked through the cemetery gates, disappearing into the darkness. A sense of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. I noticed something on the back seat, a small, old-fashioned locket. I picked it up, curious. Inside was a faded photograph of a young woman. Beneath it, a name was etched: Emily. My heart raced as I realized the implications. I looked up, staring into the darkness of the cemetery. Had I just given a ride to a ghost? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Suddenly, my cab radio crackled to life. "Driver, you there?" It was the dispatcher. "We got a call from a customer. Said you left without them. They're still waiting at 5th and Elm." I froze, the locket slipping from my fingers. My passenger. He was never there. Or rather, he was, but not in the way I had thought. I had picked up the ghost of Old Mill Road. Panic set in as I fumbled with the keys, starting the car and speeding away from the cemetery. My heart pounded in my chest, the rain blurring my vision. I needed to get away, to put distance between myself and that place. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was not alone. In the rearview mirror, I saw her. Emily. Her eyes were filled with sorrow and rage, her ghostly form flickering in and out of existence. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo. I slammed on the brakes, the cab skidding to a halt. When I turned around, she was gone. The only evidence of her presence was the locket on the back seat. I didn't know what to do, where to go. I felt trapped, haunted by a spirit seeking something I couldn't give. The story, the legend, it was all too real, and now I was a part of it. That night I quit my job as a cab driver. I couldn't go back, couldn't face the darkness that awaited me on those lonely roads. But the story didn't end there. Emily's ghost still haunts me, a constant reminder of the night I picked up a passenger from the other side. And now, every time I hear the rain, I remember her, the ghost passenger of Old Mill Road. And I wonder, who will she come for next?